Harmonica band of the Charlottenburg Choral Society plays Stars and Stripes Forever, a march from across the ocean. By 1948, America was in. If you wanted to keep up, you had to learn new tricks. Spring 1945. The German Reich is in ruins. Whilst the United States Army was occupying the western part of Germany, the American public was wondering what to do with the defeated country. To this end, the country was to be denazified, demilitarized and deindustrialized. At Allied conferences, the Americans pressed for the establishment of a democratic Germany. And the Germans, they said, should be trained in American-style democracy. Re-education, that was the watchword. Under American tuition, Germany was to learn the basic principles of democratic society. In the confusion of the immediate post-war period, ordinary Germans had other worries. They were numb with despair, helpless and lethargic, a traumatized people living among ruins. Millions were fleeing from the east to the west. Millions were searching for their families, for food, for somewhere to live. Millions with no work and no money. By the end of the war, 80% of all adult males were soldiers or prisoners of war. Hundreds of thousands were in field hospitals. 60% of the people were on the move. 40% of the men were being held prisoner outside Germany. Alongside leaflets and newspapers for the prisoners of war, films were also shown, in which the Allies made their intentions clear. The Allied conferences also discussed German collective guilt. On the 17th of July 1945, the leaders of Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union met in Potsdam near Berlin. Their major goal was the disarming, demilitarization and denazification of Germany. As a precondition of this democratization, the Germans had to realize that they were responsible for National Socialism and the war, and thus for their own and the world's tragedy. Churchill, Truman and Stalin agreed that
the German education system is to be controlled in order to eliminate all Nazi and militaristic doctrines and to permit the successful evolution of democratic ideas.
There was, however, a major obstacle to re-education. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. The directives formulated at Potsdam were so vague that none of the occupying powers felt bound to any specific measure. Germany's democratization process developed very differently from place to place right from the outset. In particular, the measures taken in the French, British and American zones were very different from those in the Soviet zone. It was only in the unique situation of the former capital Berlin, an enclave in the Soviet zone and itself divided into 4 sectors of occupation, that the measures could be coordinated. In the American zone, there were numerous difficulties at first. The Europeans, by contrast, were suspicious. One visiting British journalist had this to say.
My first trip in the summer of 1946 gave me an insight into the emotional and political fickleness of post-Hitler Germany. Some of the contempt they felt for their Allied re-educators rubbed off onto me, although outwardly they behaved as though they were grateful for the lessons in democracy they were getting. All we had succeeded in doing was replacing the civility they had shown to their former leaders by a fawning submissiveness towards the occupying forces.
A year after the end of hostilities, the war crimes trials began. The former concentration camp at Dachau became one of the central collecting points for suspects. It was also chosen as the site for the trial of the SS guards at Buchenwald concentration camp. The various Dachau trials resulted in a total of 287 death sentences. At the same time, the Americans went ahead with their policy of informing the German people about the atrocities committed in the concentration camps. American psychologists played a major part in the re-education program. They regarded the German people as a nation in need of psychiatric attention. Their treatment would only succeed if the patient not only agreed he had a problem, but actively cooperated in his therapy. A sense of guilt, it was thought, would encourage this process. As early as 1943, the Allies had decided to arraign the leaders of the Third Reich before an international military tribunal. It was decided to hold their trial in Nuremberg, whose palace of justice had survived the massive air raids. Strict security measures were taken to avoid any disruption. Journalists came from all over the world to cover what was the biggest trial in the history of mankind. On the 20th of November 1945, the proceedings opened with the reading of the indictment by the American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson. The tribunal consisted of 2 civilian judges from each of the 4 Allied powers, presided over by Lord Justice Lawrence, a senior member of the English bench. The trial of the 24 accused lasted 218 days. By the time it had finished, the transcript ran to 4 million words and 16,000 pages. Again, the daily reports from the courtroom were designed to open the eyes of the German people to the crimes of the Nazi regime. And yet, most Germans acknowledged no more guilt than did the accused in their closing speeches at Nuremberg. One important instrument was the press. The newspapers published by the military government were instructed by General Eisenhower to encourage the Germans to set up a stable and peaceful administration and to explain the policy of the occupying forces. Soon the licensed press appeared, as it was called. Germans untainted by Nazism were granted licenses to publish newspapers. On the 6th of October 1945, Munich saw the first issue of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. It was a symbolic act. The type used to print Hitler's book Mein Kampf was melted down and used for Bavaria's first licensed newspaper, in the very city where the National Socialist movement was born. But as yet there was no press freedom. Editorial policy was subject to strict controls, including this one.
The German press is to refrain from all statements and to publish or reprint no articles designed to incite distrust or hostility by the German people towards an occupying power.
At first, though, this world of information was by no means democratic. June 1945 had seen the formation of DANA, the Deutsche Allgemeine Nachrichtenagentur, a German news agency with monopoly status. It was the only source of news for the licensed press. Its task was clearly defined by the military government.
DANA will remain one of the most important channels of communication between the occupying forces and the German public. In addition, it's an excellent instrument for the democratic reorientation of the German people.
In October 1946, ownership of DANA was transferred to the German licensed press. From then on, it was staffed by German journalists, but all appointments were still made by the military authorities. Under the Nazis, radio had played a central role in government propaganda. It was also the ideal medium for political re-education.
Every Sunday morning, dear, when I am by your side, we'll hop into the wagon and off we will ride. Wait for the wagon. wagon, wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon.
The American staff officers were in no doubt that a people could only be changed by influencing all aspects of its cultural atmosphere. American music, country ballads or jazz, was used to put across a new lifestyle to young Germans especially. GIs, arm in arm with German Fräuleins, were now a common sight on the streets of the ruined cities. Chewing gum and Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike and nylons. Goodies like these spoke of the legendary wealth of the United States. They were the best argument for the American way of life.
Ja, das war manchmal ein bisschen problematisch. Übergriffe gab's auch. Also
well, there were problems at times. There were assaults. Everyone knows the Red Army committed assaults, but so did the GIs quite often. The motive was basically, now we'll show you. Then we had American theatre, Thornton Wilder, for example, and American literature, Thomas Wolfe, Hemingway, and people we knew from before, Faulkner and so on. And then there were films. There wasn't any television yet, but above all, there was music.
Filme. Fernsehen gab es noch nicht, und vor allen Dingen Musik.
Berlin and many other German cities saw the establishment of an America House. Lectures and literary readings at these American cultural institutes were used by the military government to spread information on American politics and social life. They were endowed with well-stocked libraries, a valuable support for former soldiers who needed to overcome their terrible experiences at the front and return to civilian life. Alongside playgroups for the very youngest, English language courses were also provided, another channel of information on American democracy. In the local school, American geography and English soon became the most important subjects. Under Allied control, the radio stations also put out educational programs. Radio Munich was the first to have a regular schools broadcast.
Verlaufen, alle aneinandergereiht, die Länge von 2500 Kilometer erreichen.
Den entscheidenden Einfluss hatte sicherlich
The denazification of school and university teachers doubtless had an indirect but decisive influence.
Man hat also in die Schulen und in die Hochschulen
A new kind of teacher was brought into the classrooms and lecture halls. Someone whose methods and materials came from America via the prisoner of war camps. The so-called camp universities run by the Americans had a considerable influence.
Die Lageruniversitäten der Amerikaner waren sicher von einem großen Einfluss.
The demand for re-education, for the Germans to rediscover the humanistic values of their culture, had been raised by influential German exiles in the United States as early as 1939. The first courses soon began in prisoner of war camps in America to prepare a democratic elite to lead Germany after the war. The school textbooks used during the Nazi period were withdrawn. The first new primers appeared in October 1946. Until then, the schools used emergency reprints of old pre-Nazi material. The new books featured Grimm's fairy tales instead of Nazi-style heroic legends. The military authorities applied strict ideological standards. In 1947, 136 new manuscripts for reading and arithmetic textbooks were approved, but only one new history book met the required standard.
Eins muss man natürlich im Auge behalten. Es war eine Langzeitwirkung.
There's one thing we mustn't lose sight of. It was a long-term effect.
Manches von dem, was die sogenannten 68er
I would claim, at any rate, that a lot of what the 60s generation accused their fathers of stemmed from this re-education era.
Denn die Väter Die mussten damals in Sachsen.
Their fathers had to go about in sackcloth and ashes, or else they were prisoners of war or internees, and they listened to the wise America teachings on democracy and self-determination with, to put it mildly, skepticism.
Na, gelinde gesagt, etwas ungläubig angehört.
They didn't absorb it so readily as we young people.
So aufgenommen, wie wir jungen Leute das getan haben.
Wer den Anordnungen der Polizei keine Folge leistet, macht sich strafbar.
Easter 1965. In Frankfurt, young people demonstrate against America's war in Vietnam. They have grown up in a free society by courtesy of the United States. They were taught by teachers who were re-educated by the Americans. The German public reacted aggressively. The older people were scared of young citizens making use of their right to political protest, something taken for granted in America. A generation conflict that had long been smouldering burst into flames. It was the protesters of the 60s who inaugurated the second wave of democratization in the years to come.